In this bonus episode, I share with you a Guru Viking remix video created by Zakery Mizell from the YouTube channel Zakery Mizell. Zakery's channel focuses on knowledge and beauty, and he has made several videos commenting on and even remixing episodes of the Guru Viking podcast. When I came across his remixes, I enjoyed his approach very much, and we agreed to share his work here. In this video, Zakery remakes my poetry interviews with poets John Brehm and Henry Shukman, rearranging the material and adding visual effects to create a new interpretation of those episodes. I will also share another of his Guru Viking videos in which he records a 5-hour live stream sharing his perspective on various episodes. So look out for that video on the Guru Viking channel too. Brehm, welcome to the podcast. We're going to talk about, in particular, probably we'll end up focusing on the Dharma of poetry. The tagline is how poems can deepen your spiritual practice and open you to joy. In preparing for this discussion, not only did I reread Dharma of Poetry, which I've enjoyed previously, but also I looked at your wider work. And I have to say, there's a new contender for my favorite of your poems.
Wow. Wow.
And it's At the Poetry Reading.
Oh dear.
I did warn you that was going to be a curveball.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you like that poem. It's so interesting that you mentioned it because not long ago, well, let's see, about a year and a half ago, maybe, a person alerted me to the fact that a Facebook group was going to be talking about that poem, a poetry group on Facebook, without knowing that they proceeded to, or that they were going to just savage the poem. I mean, they were very reactive and very upset about the sexual nature of the poem, and it got quite ugly. And so I have that used to be on my website. It is no longer. But it's a reflection of the environment we live in now, where people are extremely sensitive to any kind of sexual content that might be perceived as sort of outside one's expectations of what one might find in a poem. But yeah, I might rather not read that poem.
Yeah, of course, it's a poem that taps into a very particular vein of erotic, casual erotic objectification and fantasy and self-aware sinfulness, in a sense. But
Right.
that's why I like it. I think it hits that note so perfectly, and that's why I like it so much. It's, I'm not saying it's necessarily a manifesto for how one ought to live one's life in the 2023.
Right, exactly. And I wrote it in 1990, I think. So it's certainly not the kind of poem I would write now. Although that kind of self-awareness of one's foibles, one's less than noble impulses, is something that I feel poetry should include. And so in all of my work, there's a willingness to kind of look at those aspects of my behavior, the way my mind works, that aren't so flattering, that are rather, embarrassing until you acknowledge them in a kind of lighthearted way. And then it can be really fun to work with in poems. But most poets try to present themselves as, well, I shouldn't say most poets, but many poets try to present themselves as, having only the appropriate emotions, and the kind of exalted poetic feelings that one might expect to find, and so I've kind of pushed back against that in my work, and I like to include poems that show a less flattering, less noble, less exemplary side of myself. Yeah.
Well, you say less exemplary, but then I also think of Ikkyu, the poems of Ikkyu, raunchy, edgy, and
I mean, Ikkyu is, he's sort of the exception that proves the rule, right? I mean, there aren't a lot of poets who write out of the same kinds of experiences and in the same way than he does. But but I agree. I mean, I find it refreshing.
There is something divine about taking that note and producing something so beautiful, wry, accurate, and resonant from it. There's something sacralizing about that, isn't there?
I think that, I mean, I hadn't considered that before, but now that you say it, I think that's a really excellent observation. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, what is it about that takes us into the realm of the sacred? Because it doesn't seem like that would take us there. It seems the opposite of that. And yet I think you're right. And maybe it's just the willingness to acknowledge the full range of human feeling, human impulse, and to accept that, to embrace that, to not say poetry can contain these kinds of experiences, but not these kind. And one should feel these feelings, but not these feelings. And so the willingness to include and embrace the full range of human response to life, I think maybe that is the quality that takes us into the sacred. But I would love to hear more of what you think about that.
That appreciation of one's experience, that appreciation of the wife of the poet at the poetry reading in that case, and also the self-awareness of that self-aware line, my God, why doesn't he write poems about her? He will, no doubt, once she leaves him for another poet, perhaps. The observant, uninnocent one who knows a poem when it sits down in a room with him. I mean,
Yeah, it was a fun poem to write, I have to say. And I mean, I was partly reacting against the kind of over seriousness, pretentiousness of poetry readings, the kind of, church-like solemnity that often attends on the poetry reading, and just sort of, poking holes in that and giving voice to this fantasy, very inappropriate fantasy, under the circumstances. And I often wonder if that poem got anthologized quite a bit. And I often wonder if the poet in question ever saw it, and if he would have recognized himself there. But yeah, it was a fun poem to write. But the reaction to it these days is, I suspect, I mean, this one Facebook group is very intense, and that might be now the norm. But I'm glad that you like it. I have another poem that is sort of similar in terms of the kind of self-awareness. It's called Non-Harming. I wonder what the neighbors think when they see me outside with a BB gun shooting at the pigeons on our roof. I gave them a copy of my anthology, The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, and the introduction makes me sound like a person who probably wouldn't be shooting at pigeons, even if only with a BB gun, which doesn't really hurt them, I tell myself, but simply encourages them to find someplace else to deposit their smeary droppings that threaten to turn one side of our house into a bad Jackson Pollock painting. Honey, come look at this. Isn't that the mindfulness guy out there with a rifle shooting at his own house? I'm well aware of the irony, but life's like that, isn't it? A contradiction wrapped in an absurdity, etc. Still, plunking pigeons with a BB gun might not fall afoul of the injunction to not cause harm. I thought about shooting myself in the foot just to see how much it hurt, but decided against it. I tried placing scary-looking plastic owls strategically around the roof, but the pigeons laughed at that. I tried an electronic device that sent out a kind of sub-audible to humans shrieking, imitative of a bird of prey, but they didn't fall for that either. I always thought pigeons were dumb, but now I'm not so sure. They've outsmarted me so far, not that that's any great accomplishment, moving from one side of the roof to the other, where the angle for firing is not so good, and where the homeowner is exposed, even in this early morning half-light, to the watchful eyes of the neighbors.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Thank you. So it's not the kind of experience that one would typically choose to write about. You might feel some embarrassment, like here I am, this Buddhist, but I'm out there shooting at the pigeons on the roof. But going into that experience and having some fun with it, approaching it with some lightness, felt like a very rich thing to do. Yeah.
In the spirit of what you write in your book about, you encourage people to say what they enjoy about a poem. We'll get to that, how to enter a poem. What I enjoy about, something I enjoy about what you read there isn't the embarrassment of being a Buddhist, sort of renowned Buddhist shooting at the pigeons. It's the embarrassment of being a renowned Buddhist shooting at pigeons, worrying about what his neighbor thinks about that.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
That's the best part. That's the best part.
Yeah. Yeah. And imagining what they might be saying, honey, come look at this. Isn't that the mindfulness guy out there shooting at his own house? And there's worrying about so the neighbors is the audience to the experience, but the poem, invites the reader to witness this behavior. And so there's another kind of witnessing that the poet volunteers for, to be seen by the reader doing this thing that is, or might be, rather embarrassing. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that reading. I wonder if you might say something about your formation as a poet in those days. Which poets inspired you at that time?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the sort of experiences that kind of prepared the way was my experience of psychedelics. So this was, in the late 60s or early 70s, and I became really fascinated by psychedelics and did quite a lot of LSD and mescaline and other things. And the effect that had on me, it was a revelation. And I had the sense that, like, oh, right, that there's another world. There's another way of being in the world, but there is another world that is typically invisible to us, but that these sacred plants and sacred medicines can give us access to. And so that really was the spark that made me feel like, oh, I need to find a way to maintain contact with that world. I'm calling it another world. That's totally inadequate language, but there is no adequate language. But I need to, you can't do LSD every day for the rest of your life. So I knew that I wanted to find some way of maintaining contact with this sacred dimension of life, we might say, this invisible realm, or the realm of my own true nature. And so poetry became that for me. And I think I was led there in part by those early experiences with psychedelics. And the poets who were most important to me initially, William Carlos Williams was really important. And there was a Nebraska poet named Ted Kooser, whose work was quite important to me. And what I loved about Williams was the work was so immediate. It has a very Zen-like quality of immediacy, vividness, direct experience. It was relatively easy to enter his poems. They didn't present the same kinds of challenges that, say, Eliot or Pound or other high modernists' work would present. And it got me to look at the world. I had convinced myself that Nebraska was a completely uninteresting place to live, that there was nothing to see here. And when I started reading poetry, that too was a revelation. It was like, oh, okay, wait a second. Like these cornfields and, grain silos and sort of, ordinary neighborhoods and things turned out to be quite fascinating once I began to actually look. And that was, I think, the main gift of Williams's work for me, was to get me to actually look at the world, to stop and pay attention in a particular kind of way. And that just opened me to my environment in a different way, but also to poetry. It made me want to engage more deeply with poetry and to continue this way of engaging with the world that is based on, really looking, seeing, and paying attention. But one of the things that I love to do and still love to do is to walk the alleys in neighborhoods and to really pay attention to the things that kind of existed in this bardo zone between usefulness and trash. things that people weren't quite ready to throw away, but they were no longer, kind of a functioning part of the household. But there was something about that I found really compelling. And again, it wasn't that things were ostensibly or obviously beautiful. They weren't, but looked at in a certain kind of way, they kind of came to life. And it was their sort of non-beauty that drew me to them, that they were discarded things that were neglected or broken. And at the time, I wasn't aware of wabi-sabi, that aesthetic that values things that are marked by impermanence and melancholy. And but I think that's partly kind of what I was feeling. I was drawn to things that were, rusted or broken or somehow, disheveled or discarded. So it was that way of looking at things that felt really compelling to me at the time. Yeah.
How deeply do you think a poet needs to understand or be able to conceptualize something like what you've been discussing these last minutes in order to express it poetically? In your book, The Dharma of Poetry, you make this very interesting point that there are certain modes of engaging with a poem that are valid, but they're not the only one. And one of them is to find the meaning mode. And what's the poet saying? Treating poems almost as a sort of machine of meaning, a puzzle of meaning that one has to work out. But you say that's not the only way to engage with a poem, and it can actually be quite limiting. So I wonder then, to what degree does a poet need to be able to conceptualize these deep and meaningful things in order to write moving poetry in that way?
Right, and to be able to say what they're doing, to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it the way they're doing. Yeah, I'm not certain about that, how important that is. I think one has to be conscious of what one's doing, but not so much so that it kind of gets in the way of one's impulses as a writer. But yeah, that the idea that poems are primarily at least kind of verbal mechanisms for delivering meaning is a really reductive kind of left brain way of engaging with poetry. And I've been really strongly influenced in the past few years by the work of Ian McGilchrist. And I wonder if you know his work. Yeah, incredible. I do. Brilliant. And I have an essay that is going to be included in this new anthology that will come out next year from Wisdom, an essay on appreciative attention. And one of the things I talk about there is an experience I had in graduate school where professors and PhD students would often speak of interrogating a poem, and like seemingly unaware of the associations between interrogation and torture, unaware of or unbothered by those associations. But that word, the aggressiveness of that way of approaching poetry, seems to me just absolutely wrong. There's not that there's a right and wrong way exactly, but that kind of aggressive stance towards a poem, to sort of wrestle the meaning out of it by violence if necessary, is an affront to poetry, and it comes out of the grasping mind, which is always coming into our ways of understanding the world. The appreciative way, which is what I suggest in the Dharma of Poetry and in this essay on appreciative attention, is a much more gentle and open-hearted and a softer way of engaging with poems, and just going towards what we feel drawn to, what resonates for us, what we like, what feels like lit up, what gives us pleasure in a poem. To go first towards that, and then see where that takes you. But to let that aspect of the mind that is always wanting to understand and to fix meaning, let that be in the background and play kind of a supportive role. But to have one's initial entry into the poem be through the doorways of noticing and appreciating and letting the poem open, and sort of going into it. When we're analyzing a poem, we're kind of holding at a distance. So there's a quality of separation. And if you can let go of that and actually enter the poem, it's almost like a non-dual practice. It ceases to be you out here looking at the poem over there. It's more you're inside the experience as it's unfolding. And the poet's consciousness, which is still, in my view, still alive in the poem, becomes something that we can merge with our own consciousness. And it can be this kind of alchemical reaction that is really rich and can take us places that we didn't know we would get to or couldn't get to if we didn't start with the quality of appreciation, if we went right into what Elizabeth Bishop called the immodest demand for complete comprehension. I love that way of framing it, the immodest demand for complete comprehension. We want to understand everything right away. And the mind gets very frustrated when that's not happening. But the appreciative attention, that way of entering it just sort of sidesteps that whole aspect of the mind.
And something else that you write about, this entering through the doorway of appreciation and noticing. You also sometimes use that word, noticing. Particularly in a group context, group discussion context, is that you say that it also relieves people of the need to try to come up with something clever to say.
Yeah.
You mentioned Eliot before. I've heard it said that Eliot and those other high modernists were a part of that actual lifting poetry a little bit out of the reach, as wonderful as Eliot is, and he is wonderful, lifting poetry out of the reach, putting it into, because of all the allusions and so on, references in Eliot and so on, taking it into the realm rather of the specialist, into the realm of the person equipped with the right apparatus, the right critical lens to be able to engage with poetry. Otherwise, it's highbrow. Poetry's highbrow. It's what intellectuals do. It's what academics do. It's for the ivory tower. It's not for us.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think of that narrative that, say, the high modernists or so lifted the poetry into the realm of the specialists?
Yeah, that's certainly what Williams, how he saw it, and he hated Eliot. I mean, he hated him. He hated his work, and he hated him. And he said, Eliot and Pound took us back into the schoolroom. He said we had just succeeded in creating a kind of American idiom, and Eliot and Pound dragged us back to Europe and the European tradition, and the academic tradition. And I every now and then I'll try to reread Eliot, and I recognize his brilliance, particularly I think in the later poems, and the early poems, the Prufrock poems. But the Wasteland, it just feels like I can't connect with that poem at all. It just feels, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's not an enjoyable experience. So for me, Williams was, at the complete other end of the spectrum. So immediate experience often in his poems, and a very vivid and sort of simple conception of what a poem is and can do. And there's a kind of aliveness in his work, I find, that is really refreshing, and that doesn't rely on or require any literary training. And that's the thing about this particular approach that I use when I teach poems, just inviting students to say what they like about a poem. Anybody can do that. It's easy. It doesn't require any special skill, or you can just, it's so freeing. I mean, I've seen people just come alive because the intimidation that they have felt around poetry, like, oh, I don't get it, or I'm not smart enough, or I haven't read enough, so I can't say anything that's valuable. You can see people like the freedom that comes from dropping that and just saying, wow, I love this image, or I love this line, or, you know, I love the voice of the poem, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's easy to do. Anybody can do that. And when that is received and amplified by the group, where other people are saying, yeah, I love that too, or I also love this, the poems come alive, and they reveal more of themselves under the light of that collective appreciative attention. It's really quite remarkable. And the entire group intelligence becomes enlivened with this sort of warmth and appreciation. It's no longer competitive, you know, like I want to say something smarter than everybody else, or I want to show people what I know, you know, and that sort of thing, or I want to present like an interpretation of the whole poem. So it's quite a refreshing change from the experience that people often have in school, which so often makes people hate poetry because they feel like, well, I don't get it. It's frustrating. And so they just sort of turn away from it. And this is a way of kind of reestablishing a more fruitful and friendly relationship with poems. Yeah.
In the Dharma of poetry, you do nonetheless say that poetry can be morally instructive. But you make an important distinction, a sort of show, don't tell, it seems, kind of distinction.
Yeah.
You say, without, to quote you, without ever making a direct assertion about how one should live. I wonder if you might say something about that. How is it, in your view, that poetry can have moral instruction in it? And why is it important to show rather than tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the way I talk about it in the book is that poems can be exemplary. They can exemplify modes of awareness, modes of attention, and ways of behaving in the world that we might choose to emulate, we might choose to adopt as our own. So to use my own example, to keep coming back to Williams, so I learned from him how to look at the world, how to pay attention. And that is not obviously a moral act, and yet I think it is actually. Learning to attend to the world with a kind of mindfulness and warm-heartedness does have a moral dimension. I mean, if we move through the world in that way, we're more likely to be kind, to be patient, and to value the world, and not just kind of stomp through it as we might otherwise be tempted to do. So ways of attending to the world, I think poems come out of exceptional states of consciousness. The best poems do. I think they arise when the poet is in a flow state, is one way to describe it. But the poet is embodying, expressing a quality of awareness that is really powerful. And when we read a poem and when we attune to that, we can absorb it and begin to see that we too can look at the world in this way. We can move through the world in this appreciative way. We can cultivate those states of awareness in ourselves. And, you know, the poem that I start with, the Isa poem, where he says, where he cautions the cricket to, he says, I'm going to roll over, so please move, cricket. You know, and that I think has a ethical, moral dimension of just like, okay, how do we treat other creatures? How do we engage with the world in that way so that we don't cause harm? So that too, the way poets behave in their poems can serve as an example of how we might choose to live. So it's different from poems that tell us, you know, what to do or how to think or what to believe. I don't especially like those poems. those kinds of poems, but they can, give us examples of how to move through the world and yeah, how to engage with it in our awareness.
What is the unmistakable whiff of ego?
Unmistakable, but also maybe indescribable. Yeah, that's a little hard to pinpoint, but I mean, I certainly, the difference in my own work when I'm writing from a flow state of consciousness where the ego sort of disappears for a while and you become a conduit for something that is larger than yourself, that just comes through you. And so you're not trying to control what happens on the page quite so much. You're being led, you're being guided. It's a wonderful experience. And I'm sure you're a writer. I'm sure you've had those moments where you felt like something's coming through me that I wasn't aware of before, that I wasn't planning to say. That's the absence of ego. Ego comes into the picture when there's too much of an overt desire to control what comes and to create certain effects. And, I think, I can definitely feel that in my own work. When my writing goes in that direction, I can quickly see that, like, okay, this is not me writing from my true self. This is the ego taking over. This is the ego speaking. And maybe, again, it's the desire to create a certain kind of effect, to appear smart or elegant or, noble or whatever it might be. That can be something that you can, I think, attune to and see when it shows up on the page. But it's a little hard. It's not like there's a hard and fast rule around, how to recognize that. But I think you can sort of know it when you see it.
You write here that a poet may be defined as one who stops.
I think I make that statement in the discussion of Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, where the entire poem is predicated on Frost stopping and looking into this field and just watching the snow fall. And the horse, he says, my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. The horse is accustomed to, going on this route. Accustomed to just following habit. And so to stop without an ostensible reason for doing so is puzzling to the horse. And, in that sense, the horse might be an embodiment of our own kind of ongoing habitual momentum. And so a poet is someone who is able to step out of that, to step out of one's habitual momentum, and to stop and look at the world, look at his or her or their own experience in a way that we can't do when we've got our heads down and we're just moving through the world in a purely pragmatic kind of way. Yeah, so just the sense of stepping outside the flow of experience and bringing a quality of awareness to it that depends upon one's ability to slow down and to not be just carried along by the mind's momentum, by the kind of proliferation of thought or just doing what one has always done. So, stopping may not be the most precise word, but I thought the Frost poem gives us a great example of that, that he chooses to stop for no good reason, for no practical reason, and then has this incredibly rich experience of watching the snow fall and his emotional response to that, which is really lovely, but would not happen if he had just sort of kept his head down and gone about his way. So
I'm thinking of poetry that I've read and also poetry that I've heard in various contexts, good and bad, or should we say less effective and more effective. What about this quality of profundity in poetry?
Mm.
Poetry seems to have this ability to communicate profundity,
Yeah.
sometimes in a way that there's no real way of putting it into words. The poem doesn't seem to do it, and I, as a listener or reader, can't express it, but nonetheless, it's
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but also, I can remember experiences of listening to poetry that attempted to reach for profundity. It was
Mm.
clear that there was a reaching for that. There
Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
attempt, an overt attempt, I suppose, through various means
Yeah.
to recreate that transmission of profundity, but it failed almost because it was so overt. How does a poet achieve profundity without obscuring that profundity in the reaching for it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that poems that reach for it, that are striving for some kind of wisdom or profundity, are doomed to fail. Um, I think that, it's again this idea of the poet as a conduit, that you get out of your own way, you let the ego dissolve to the extent that it can, and just you open to something that is bigger than you are, that you didn't know that you knew, um, and you just allow something to come through you and to be guided by something that is beyond your conscious control. And that may or may not take you to something profound, but it creates the conditions for wisdom to enter, precisely because you have let the ego, and the desire to control, or the desire to say something significant, you've let that recede into the background, into its kind of proper supportive role. Um, and so there's a kind of quality of allowing that. I mean, of course, we cultivate that in meditation, right? I mean, we cultivate this sense of allowing, not trying to control our minds or our experience. That sort of openness can be a way for profundity or wisdom to move through us into the poem. And it's a gift when that happens. And I think it's pretty rare, for all but the most genius of poets. But when it happens, it's wonderful, because in a poem it's embodied. There's a kind of a richness, when wisdom shows up in a poem rather than in prose or in some other form. Poems have this embodiment of richness that can, make the experience of whatever teaching quality that the poem might have, make that much more impactful and easier to absorb. Yeah.
How does a poet find beautiful language,
Mm.
find language that bucks the trend of cliche
Mm.
without falling into, I suppose, exotic verbiage for its own sake?
Yeah. Yeah. That is the challenge. How to make the language fresh and vivid and engaging, without straining after poetic effects. Yeah, that is very challenging. And my poems are very conversational. The language is not exalted. Yeah, it's hard. I think that for me, the first rule is the language has to feel natural. And sometimes when I mentor some younger poets, and um, they'll say things in their poems that you would never actually say to another person speaking. And that always feels artificial to me. And I feel like if you're saying something in a poem that you would never actually hear another person speak, that should probably be, eliminated or changed in some way. But I think the language is inherently musical. And so there too, you just kind of have to let the musical qualities of the language, to let its sonic dimensions, its rhythmic dimensions, just sort of come forth naturally without too much manipulation. And of course, one is always paying a great deal more attention to the language when you're writing a poem than you are typically when you're just speaking. But nevertheless, I think allowing the language, the music that's inherent in the language, the sound qualities, the rhythmic qualities, to, insofar as possible, let that come through without too much manipulation. And I think, for me, when I read the poets who I love most, Elizabeth Bishop, for example, James Schuyler is another, the lyricism is very subtle, but it's really powerful. And you absorb that. You absorb the musical dimension of poetry from reading other poets, and that will come into your own work in a way that is transformed by your own engagement with it, but still kind of carries some of the flavor of the poets that you've been reading. So yeah, it's not easy what you're asking.
Reading poetry aloud, how should we approach that? There can be a tendency to somehow read it in a very unnatural rhythm, emphasizing certain words, a sort of poetic, put on poetic emphasis. But on the other hand, can one be too conversational and throw away? I sometimes hear people reading poetry trying to avoid that kind of very stilted, overly quote unquote poetic approach, and then almost throw the poem away with the casualness of it.
Right.
How can we read a poem so that the poem can come through with our reading as a vehicle for it rather than as a sort of impediment for it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there too, I think it's a question of finding the sweet spot, the middle way between a kind of a self-consciously performative way of reading the poems in this artificial voice, which is, I think is deadly. I so stop engaging when I hear that voice. And then the other extreme is, as you say, so casual that it feels like it's just being thrown away, and you can't tell, like, is the poet still giving the introduction to the poem, or is this now the poem? I've had that experience where you think, wait, I guess the poem started. I didn't realize it. So yeah, finding a sweet spot in there and just letting the poem itself guide you. I mean, I think when you're reading the poem, if you're really attuned to the language, if you're really sensitive to the language and to the rhythms of the poem, it will come through if you just allow it, with, again, not trying to control it too much, but also giving it some energy, giving it some aliveness, your own aliveness, bringing that into the reading of the poem is always helpful. Yeah.
What role, if any, do you see for memorization in a poet's formation, in a poet's ongoing education and nourishment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I myself have not practiced a lot of memorization. I mean, there's certain poems that I have memorized, and Frost is a great example. I was reading a biography of Frost recently, and this writer, I can't remember his name, said that it's difficult to not to memorize Frost poems. If you read them enough, they're so memorable. They just kind of stick, and you find, like, oh my God, I know that poem by heart. I wasn't even trying. So I'm probably not the best person to speak to this because I haven't done a lot of memorization, but I know, many poets find that really, really helpful to commit poems to memory. But since I don't do that, it's hard for me to speak to the benefits of that. What I will say is, and this is sort of related, I think rereading poems is profoundly important. So the poems that I love most, I have read, hundreds of times. And so I have absorbed them, even if I can't recite them. I have had a deep, profound experience with the poem many, 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 many times. So I have seen different things in it. I've had a different experience of the poem, but more than that, I have absorbed it. So it's in me. It's sort of in my nervous system, and it's part of my poetic metabolism, I guess would be one way of saying it. It's deeply within, and I think that's really important to reread poems, especially poems that one finds, particularly meaningful or powerful, to not just sort of read them a few times and feel like, oh, well, now I know that poem, but to keep coming back and re-engaging. I think that's really important.
Henry Shukman and John Brehm.
I'm so delighted, over the moon, in fact, quoting you, John, in your book, The Dharma of Poetry. This is a book about poetry as a source of wisdom. It argues not that poems are or should be didactic or prophetic, or that poets should be regarded as sages, making grand pronouncements about the meaning of life, but that poems embody and implicitly endorse ways of being in the world that anyone engaged in spiritual practice, or anyone wanting to live a more mindful life, might want to emulate. Writing poetry is by its nature a spiritual activity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here we have two separate poetries: the poetry that one reads and the poetry that one writes. And the relationship of both of those to spiritual practice, whatever that might be. That might be something that's worth defining too. Spiritual practice. What does it mean to each of you, and how does that relate to both reading and writing poetry? And Henry, in episode 131 of this podcast, in your dialogue with Rupert Spira, you were describing your initial love of poetry, and you characterized it in this way: as a search for lines that brought something alive within us, some sense of beauty, and more than that, some truth, some kind of natural order of things that recognized something about reality that we couldn't normally see. I guess I would have to say that at the start it was in some sense a spiritual pursuit. If by spirituality we mean coming to an experience or a way of experiencing that's much closer to this moment. So I wonder if we might start there with this idea of poetry, both in terms of reading and writing, as a spiritual practice, and what is a spiritual practice?
If I just think back to my own early interest in childhood, in poetry, especially probably around the beginning of puberty, actually, is when it really kicked in. I was very interested. I got really interested in what is it to be alive, really, and are there different ways of being alive? I mean, is there my ordinary sense of what kind of how it is to be alive? I noticed that it could change. I could sometimes feel much more alive, much more connected to the world I was in. And so just something about the relationship between myself and the world seemed to be more variable than I'd realized. And sometimes it felt much more thrilling, and one of those times was, the first time I really wrote a poem. I think the quote, the bit you just quoted me on was talking about getting into enjoying poetry, reading poetry, basically. And I was very lucky to have a friend who's a great poet, Sam Willis. He's been a lifelong friend. And he and I, actually from even earlier than, say, the age of 13, we got into looking at poetry books in the library and trying to find bits we liked, and knowing that there were nuggets we'd come across that really captivated us in some way. They were just beautiful in themselves, and the imagery they brought to mind was beautiful, but also they woke something up in me. I felt kind of something come alive in me that I wanted to be alive in me, and so that had been going on for a few years. I got this idea that with poetry, it wasn't about sort of sitting down and just reading through stuff. It was about looking for what had some charge in it that woke something up in me. That was what I was really looking for. So I didn't care whether I'd happily disregard 500 lines in the interest of 1.5 lines that just had the thing I really wanted. And and but then so, we had he and I, Sam and I, both had this English teacher who was very encouraging and sort of would get us to try to write poems. And so the idea of writing a poem was also kind of on my radar. But there was one particular evening I remember when I was staring out of my bedroom window in Oxford, where I grew up, and I suddenly felt this scene below me was so beautiful. It was just, the ordinary street we lived on with a street light on below and a tree next to it, and the light falling a certain way, and sort of the shadow on the ground, and the houses in semi-gloom, and the night sky above, or the darkening sky above, actually sky rather pale and the world dark below it. And it was just really, it just caught me, the beauty of it, in a new way. And with it came some lines, or a first line. And I just wanted to get that line down. And I did. And another one followed, and another one followed. And I realized they were sort of evoking what I was feeling about this scene. So it's sort of combination of my response to the scene before me and an evocation of that scene being able to come forth in lines of words that expressed exactly that little nugget in me that was sort of wanting to be alive, and it made it all more alive, and it was a really, and by the time I'd finished, I knew when I'd finished this thing, and I was trembling with excitement, and I felt awake in the world in a way that I never had before. And to me, at the time, I didn't have the word spiritual really in my vocabulary, but now looking back on it, I think, well, damn, that's what spirituality is for me. It's being alive in the world, in a way that I really feel I'm inhabiting this life that I've been given, whatever life is, and having a different sense of what life is than an ordinary humdrum, sequence of tasks that I'm doing or not doing and should be doing, or something like that. It's a really different way of being alive. And to me, that was, poetry actually was my first real kind of solid manifested discovery that it was possible truly to be alive in the world in some way that felt frankly more alive, to excuse my clumsy language. But anyway, that's enough from me. Sorry.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Henry. I have so much to say in response, and what you say very much describes my own experience in slightly different terms, but the feeling of aliveness and awakening, and that just longing to be in the world, as you say, in a different way, in a way that's more alive, more connected, maybe more empathic, more intuitive, more right brain, and I'll talk more about that later, I think. But the 60s came to Nebraska in the early 70s. They finally arrived a little bit late. But so there was a lot of drug use, of LSD and mescaline and marijuana and all kinds of things. So I was very eager to experiment with those drugs, or now I would call them medicines, sacred medicines. And when I did that, it was like, it was a revelation. I mean, just to see that, like, this ordinary world, this dull world that you described, Henry, of just doing what you're supposed to do and kind of getting on with things, that there was more than that, that there was this magical quality, at the very heart of existence. And I experimented with that pretty early when I was in the ninth grade, and continued for a number of years. And, I wouldn't have at the time thought of it as a spiritual experience, but looking back now, I see that's what it was. I mean, there was a lot of sitting around listening to Led Zeppelin, of course, and that may or not qualify as a spiritual experience. um, but I think, you can't kind of do that forever. And I at some point, poetry presented itself to me as another way of staying in contact with this other way of being in the world. this more connected, more alive, more responsive, less concerned with the externalities of life, and more willing to go under the surface and into the depths. And so poetry just felt like, I mean, I knew very quickly that that's what I wanted to do with my life. I had some of those moments that you describe, just looking at an ordinary street and ordinary houses and feeling this quality of luminosity, and just sensing like, oh, wow, I want that. And I want a way to evoke that in, through writing. So yeah, my experience is very, very similar to yours. And yeah, yeah. And perhaps it's a template for most poets as they begin. And I think that's, one of the things I love about poetry, both reading it and writing it, is that it allows us to stay in contact with, you might say, the sacred, or the moment, or reality, or whatever inadequate term you might want to use. Um, I feel like poets are, as a tribe, never bought the lie of materialism and separation. And so being in that world was itself a way of not participating in that particular delusion.
When I started getting into poetry with this friend Sam, who was a key component of that, really, we were getting inspired particularly by, well, the Imagist poets of London, of whom Pound and Eliot counted themselves in that crew, but there were also a whole load of English poets as well. It was all London based, and all of them, professed to be in some ways inspired by the Tang Dynasty Chinese poets. And those poets, who we got into as well, they embodied exactly what you're talking about, that this life where you're not so engaged with the worldly stuff of the court life, the bureaucratic life of China at that time, and the kind of making your way in society and kind of life, but much more concerned with the intimate relationship with the world, and especially with the landscape, and sort of being part of a landscape, and poetry as a means of really sort of studying and being engaged with, and kind of sensing what it is to be alive in this world, and then expressing that. So you've got the dual aspect of really the poetry helping you to sense what it is, and to sense that those levels of connection. You put it very well, like connected, intuitive, and so on. You just said, and the luminous quality sometimes things have. So what I think we were tuning into was, yeah, all of that possibility from those wondering, non I don't know, society engaged early Chinese poets. And of course those in their turn, they had influenced the beats, Snyder and Kerouac, etc. And as the beats influenced us, and this idea that you could live a really different kind of life than what we were basically being presented with as a path in life.
Yeah.
And poetry being the thread and the medium and the atmosphere, really, that could make that different way of living make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And just create an opening for that, like just to see, like, oh, it can be done. These people are doing it.
Yeah.
I love what you say about, a more intimate relationship with the landscape or with the world. That quality of intimacy, I think, is really an important aspect of poetry. And I think, for me too, I was influenced early on, especially by Williams, and some of the other Imagist poets. I don't know that I was aware of the Chinese poets directly so much at that time, but their influence on people like James Wright, who I read very deeply, and Robert Bly, and certainly Williams. But that quality of attention that they brought to their experience, that for me was really inspiring, because I had convinced myself that there was nothing interesting whatsoever about Nebraska. You know, it was just, ordinary towns, and then, just miles and miles of cornfields. And um, I was very attracted to the mountains of Colorado, and my father had relatives out west, and we would drive out to California in the summer and go through these spectacular landscapes that were just almost overwhelming in their beauty. And so in Nebraska, by contrast, just felt like, well, there's nothing here. Like there's nothing worth paying attention to. And when I started writing poetry, that all changed. It's like, oh, suddenly, a fence post, fascinating. Or a piece of junk that somebody put out in the back alley, something that was discarded, something in the kind of the Bardo realm between usefulness and trash. But anyway, all these things, it suddenly, I felt like, well, it's the quality of attention that you bring. It's not the object or the experience itself. It's, can you, see the world in a different way that takes you to that place of aliveness, or creates that sense of aliveness within you that you spoke about so beautifully. So yeah, there too, another interesting parallel, that those were the poets who initially kind of lit that flame. Yeah, and also Williams was not intimidating, of course. His poems were like, oh, I could do something like that. I couldn't write The Wasteland, but yeah, that was also very refreshing, because like most people, I had the sense that poetry was this arcane, immensely difficult art that nobody could really understand. And Williams was a refreshing reminder that that's not the case. So yeah.
Yeah. I can very much relate to that thing of finding that the most sort of ordinary things could be full of beauty. I remember that being a big thing for me early on, my early poetic days. I'd be looking for a certain sort of atmosphere, that a cat sitting under a bush in the rain or something, or just a lamppost on its own on the corner of a street and nobody around, or just very ordinary things, but they've got a certain aura around them that I would recognize as, oh, that's what I'm looking for. That's the thing. Because again, it would light something up in me. And it didn't need to be anything exceptional at all. It was a different way of looking. But I don't think I was smart enough, actually, thinking back to that time. I don't think I was smart enough to recognize that it was about my own quality of attention. I felt more that I was looking for the things that had that. I didn't. But I think you're absolutely right. It really is about our own quality of attention.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have been able to express that idea, or to be aware of that back then. I'm retrospectively kind of seeing that that's what I was kind of discovering without knowing it. But I also had that feeling of looking. I used to, when I was, a teenager, I would sneak out of the house at like 1 o'clock in the morning just to walk around the neighborhoods, because at that time of night, I would often have that experience, like some house or lamppost or some ordinary thing would suddenly be kind of seemed like it was like lit from within, and had this extraordinary quality. And I loved it. I mean, it was just beautiful. But again, it was almost, I think, maybe even better that it came from ordinary things where you weren't expecting it, like, oh, that weed is beautiful.
Yes. Oh God, yes. And that vacant lot.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I'm remembering also that and that's something else I want to ask you about, actually, meaning Sam and we looked for, I think maybe it's a natural thing at that age when kids are trying to find their own space in the world. We looked for places that nobody else was interested in. The back alley with just,
Yeah.
garbage bins in it. We loved it in the way that we didn't like the high street, and
Yeah.
and a little yard that, has got an old overgrown, a rake standing there, the weeds are grown over, it hasn't been used in so long. We liked those sort of unused places, abandoned places. That was where we felt at home. And we found something of that quality there. But hey, I wanted to.
But can I just respond? Because that
Yeah,
was
please, please,
for
yeah.
me. The first apartment I lived in when I moved out of my parents' house when I was just in college, and there were still some dirt alleyways behind the houses, and I loved them. And it was just that sense of like, this is disregarded by everybody, and to see these broken down, cars or, rusted bicycles or tools or, paint cans or whatever. Yeah, that was the world that I loved. And I still long for that. I long to be in a place that has those kind of alleyways. It's a little hard to find these days. And I wouldn't have had this term in my vocabulary, but there was a wabi-sabi quality
Yes.
in objects that were, sort of lowly and
Yes.
disintegrating, had this kind of melancholy quality to them. I very much resonated with that. And so everything you said just feels like, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Just riffing on that. I mean, I'm thinking it's somehow the quality of neglect was beautiful. It's
Exactly.
because other people aren't interested. That's where I want to be. I wonder if there's some kind of affiliation or a kinship a poet feels with
Yeah.
the neglected, that we want to that's where we belong, and that we want to resurrect that. We want to bring that to light, the very fact that it's kind of being allowed to be itself because people aren't messing with it.
Right.
That's sort of, that's, even though it's an ordinary human object,
Yeah.
there's something about it being clearly abandoned,
Yeah. Cast out.
cast out, yeah, that makes it kin for the
Yeah.
poet. I
Yeah.
wonder if there's something to that.
Oh, yeah, I think
Yeah,
so for
yeah,
sure. For me, there is anyway. And,
yeah.
you're talking about the neglected things and being attracted to the neglected. And, there's no better way than to be neglected than to become a poet, right? I mean, so maybe
Exactly.
that's the kinship.
Except for the extremely rare poor poet who becomes a public poet.
Yeah.
The challenge of being, oh, yeah, we wouldn't wish it on anyone, really.
Yeah. There's a great
But
quote by Philip Larkin in one of his letters. He talks about how some poets, you know, will make a living as a poet, going around and giving readings and workshops and, writer in residence and things. He said, I would hate that. That doesn't appeal to me at all. He said, I would hate to go around pretending to be me.
yes, yes, yes. But hey, here's that was something that was bubbling up for me a moment ago, was like, did you have an ally or a colleague or a companion in arms? At,
Mm,
is that something? Because I know that I mentioned Sam Willis. It was critical for me to have.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know. Well, I don't know what would. Maybe it wasn't as critical as I think, but it seemed, when I look back on it anyway, it seems like it was so good to have
yeah,
somebody else who was interested in the same search.
yeah, yeah. I didn't at first, and in fact, my parents were not encouraging about my poetry writing initially. And I remember my father, I think they saw it as a kind of bizarre waste of time. And my father at one point suggested I go to a trade school. He himself was a carpenter and he had been a mechanic and he could fix anything. And, he was great with that kind of thing. And anyway, but that gives you a sense of how like not attuned they were to the kind of person I was. I mean, I was a dreamy kid who was, not good with practical stuff, but they sort of wanted that. So for me, in some ways, that was a good thing. I don't think I would have done well if I had parents who were really encouraged me to write poetry, because it was kind of a way of defining myself against their way of being. And I mean, they were wonderful people and smart people, but they just were not artistic or literary in any way. And so my writing poetry was a very odd thing to do in their eyes. And I didn't have any friends who were interested in poetry initially. But when I went to college, I was very lucky to have my first poetry teacher was wonderful. And he was incredibly enthusiastic, and he was just passionate about poetry. I mean, he was just on fire with it. And that was huge. And he was only about 10 years older than me. So, um, so in that sense, I found very early someone who, read all my poems and would turn me on to different poets. And that was crucial. I'm not sure how my path would have unfolded if it hadn't been for him. So in that sense, I did have somebody like your friend. Yeah.
Right.
Something in what both of you are saying about this relationship of the poet to writing poetry. What about the relationship of the poet to the audience? Does the poet just write for himself, or is there a sense of writing for an audience? And the audience, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 different sorts of audiences. There's the audience, there's the cultural, the historical. You're sort of participating in that, right back to the Tang Dynasty in your case, Henry, and in reaction to all these sorts of socioeconomic circumstances and ways of being that you were surrounded by, John. So there's sort of dialoguing in a way with that stuff, or participating in it somehow, even if reacting against it. But then also there's a sense, I presume, does a poet expect to be read? Are there financial thoughts of legacy, or thoughts of notoriety, or does that enter into the process? And how does that interact with this deeply, almost, what can we say, personal, transcendent, or immanent relationship of the poet to the writing process?
Well, look, speaking for myself, I would say anytime I try to write a poem for any reason, including that I want to write a poem, it won't work.
Exactly.
It only works to the small extent that any of mine do work, which is an open question for others to decide. When I feel they've worked is when there's absolutely no purpose to it. It is just its own expression. And, so purpose, including any putative audience. But then it got me thinking, I know that there's because there's something in me that recognizes if it's a false note, and so that's some kind of quote unquote audience, that isn't exactly my ordinary sense of self, and so I wonder, I mean, you could get grandiose and say it's written for nothing but, the creation itself, or, or a god or something, but I mean, I wouldn't put it in those terms, but there is some sense that I have to be letting go of any of my ideas about what a good poem is. The most fatal thing for me is if I try to write a good poem, fatal for any poem, that is. So I don't know, I sort of want to say definitely no audience in mind, but somehow I feel that's not exactly right, because there's some sense of something in me that's wanting to be satisfied, and that recognizes if it is or it isn't. But maybe I need to say a little bit about my own process, actually, to make sense of this, which is that I tend to get an inkling of a poem, and some of them I don't get to in time and they're gone, and some of them I do get to in time, and something happens, something appears on the page, and I tend to want it to come kind of by itself, you know, um, but then I might actually tinker with it for years even, but I hope that it will end up feeling as spontaneous as the first iteration of it did, although I've actually tinkered with it a bit. I mean, maybe a bit, but a lot. Little things a lot. I'll revisit it repeatedly, and can I read it straight through without a glitch? No, there's something wrong there, and then it might take, again, even years to iron out whatever that is, to a point where I feel I can read it smoothly without getting caught on something. So that initial so I suppose there is sort of successive audiencing that I do of it, I guess. But I'm not thinking of a putative external audience. No. How about you, John?
Yeah, no, I feel much the same way. And you were talking about that different part of you that recognizes when a false note. And I think that one way to describe that, for me anyway, is to see it as a kind of internalized composite of all the poetry that you've read that you love. Like you've somehow absorbed a certain kind of aesthetic, or just, I mean, not like rules of what to do and what not to do, but a sense on some maybe subconscious level that, like, Wordsworth would not like that line, or something like that. That all those great poems that you've read and loved are in there, and in a way, you're writing for them, for those poets, or you're writing to come into alignment with them, in some way, rather than thinking about, like, are people going to like this? When you're writing something, I mean, that would be deadly.
Yes.
And of course, most poets don't have much of an audience, really. I mean, it's not like, you're writing a novel that, 1 million people might read. But my teacher, A.R. Archie Ammons, had a wonderful comment about this. He was asked who he writes for, and he said, I don't really write to an audience. I never imagined an audience. I imagine other lonely people such as myself. I don't know who they are or where they are, and I don't care. But those are the people whom I want to reach. And I thought that was lovely. I write for other lonely people such as myself.
That's
not
beautiful.
A big auditorium or some
Right.
literary critic, but some lonely person who's looking for something, trying to connect. And
Yeah, that's lovely. I do remember actually once I had this idea that it just popped up in my mind, that I was imagining, that I was, if a poem of mine appeared in some small journal, and decades later, one of the few rare surviving copies of that journal was in a junk store in somewhere in the UK, and somebody browsing the junk store happened to open up that particular volume and happened to land on my poem, and it did something to their day. That's all I wanted.
yeah, that's enough.
So they're in a place of neglect. The poem's in a volume of neglect. and there's somebody drawn to that place of neglect, and there they
Right.
find something.
And then
And
that moment of connection, of awakening.
Yes, exactly. And it changes their day. That's
their life,
maybe, yeah. But it's enough if it's just their day.
Right.
In fact, it's just enough. It's just the next 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just this sort of glimpse into, like, oh, there's this other way of seeing and being.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And now I'm just wondering, what's that got to do with mindfulness, and what's that got to do with spiritual practice, and what is if there's an interruption there, what is the interruption, and what's it interrupting?
Yeah.
if you see what I mean, like the little pause button that's hit on someone's day
Yeah.
that a
Yeah.
poem, of course, can produce.
Yeah.
What's that got to do with mindfulness? And
Yeah.
yeah, it seems to me like it's got a lot to do with mindfulness, and it makes me feel sad almost that the word mindfulness for many has become almost like a chore, like a
Yeah.
duty. And millions of people are prescribed. Workplaces are bringing it in, and all the employees get a subscription to the Headspace app.
To make
And
them more productive.
yeah, and like it's sort of taking the magic out of it.
Yeah.
The whole point is that it's a stray, random reconnecting with your very own life
Yeah.
before.
Remembering who you truly are, your true
Yeah,
self. And I
exactly.
think that's one dimension of poetry that you might describe as spiritual. I mean, I think it is spiritual, that
Yeah.
poems remind us of our true nature, that our whole culture is designed to make us forget.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
this idea of a pause, yeah, and there's this concept of the sacred pause, this momentary stopping of just the ongoing momentum of the mind, of just the way of being in the world that's just getting one thing done after another, or being, totally engaged with one's problems and unable to kind of stop and just be. And I think in that sense, like that pause, that interruption is really important, and I mean, I love it when I experience that in reading poems or writing poems. I mean, it's just wonderful, and refreshing. And it, like you said, it reconnects us to
Yeah,
something really fundamental that we don't see if we're just skimming across the surface of life.
yeah.
And somebody, I can't remember if it was Joseph Goldstein or Jack Kornfield, one of those great mindfulness teachers, who described the sacred pause as a kind of temporary enlightenment. It's just a
I haven't
moment.
heard it. Yeah,
Yeah. But because in that moment, you're free of grasping an aversion,
yeah,
wanting things to be different than they are. You're in this very receptive, open state.
yeah,
You're in the quality of pure awareness is
yeah,
present, or it's always present. But I mean,
yeah.
you're you're in it in a way that you're usually not. So
Yes.
I think that's, it's not just about like, oh, reading some poems and then sitting down and meditating on the poem or something that direct, although that can be a wonderful practice. But I think it's all about stopping, shifting, seeing
Mhm.
differently. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Now I'm feeling a little bit of devil's advocate creeping up in me, which
Uh,
is
we've
I want
agreed,
to.
we've agreed on everything so far.
Yeah,
And
I know. Well, I
the
think we're
audience
going to
is
agree on
waiting
this
on.
too. I'm sure we will, but I'm wanting to correct myself really. The idea that a poem is just for that kind of mindfulness is wrong,
Hmm.
Henry. Because actually, of course, you can do that by, you know, a little bit of practice, a moment of just, taking a breath if you like that, or maybe you don't like the breath so much. Let me just be aware of this whole space I'm in.
Right, right.
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Oh, look at the sofa doing its beautiful sofa thing. Here I am. I'm back. I can do that. But a poem somehow it's more than that. It's
Yeah,
got
that's
this rich world it invites us into or something, or it's not merely that I get more mindful. It's like, because there's 10,000 ways of doing that. But a poem, on the other hand, is this incredible
yeah,
artifact that someone's created. And yeah, they've probably created it out of a very present state of mind and a very appreciative and alive and, maybe a emotion filled or, recollected recollected in tranquility, whatever, driven somehow by human experience and some meeting of the human drama with a moment. and has produced this beautiful expression of the richness of human life in the world. That's much more than just the pause button. Again, I'm
Yeah.
talking to myself. Henry, note this, please, because isn't that the case? So we mustn't reduce it to just that,
Yeah.
because it's a thing of beauty. Listening to a bit of Beethoven, it's not just about mindfulness. It's, my gosh, there's this whole engagement with the world and with what
Yeah.
a human life is. And the amazing thing about poetry, I think, is that it can do it in such a small space, that great poems, condense the human drama and the beauty and the catastrophe and all of it, and loss and grief and triumph and suffering and love, and all of it can be in a little poem. Now,
It's
how the hell does somebody do that?
yeah, how is that even possible?
How is
Yeah.
that yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Because poems, as you say, are artifacts. I mean, they're works of art, they're created, they're not, and they do more than allow us to kind of pause and enter this mindful state. And they exist in language. I mean, they're embodied in language. And there's something about the immersive experience of reading a great poem that I mean, everything's involved, right? Your mind's involved, but emotionally you're engaged. The sensual qualities of the language, the music, the rhythm, all these things that are not totally unique to poetry, but that manifest in poetry in a way that they, in a more condensed or intense way than they do in prose. Like, that's part of what makes poetry such a transportive experience. And when that's done well, when you read a beautiful line of poetry, I mean, it's incredible. And it's not because of what it does, but what it is. And just, I don't know how to say it, but it's, um and that's one thing. I mean, this is a little different subject, but I wish more poetry teachers in traditional academic settings would concentrate more on that, on saying what they love about poetry, and not be so focused on these more scholarly approaches. Um, but but yeah, I agree totally that there, and maybe it's hard to describe, you know, all that a great poem can do. But I think, one of the things it does that's sort of paradoxical is it uses language to take us beyond language, to take us someplace where language can't really go, but it's through language that we get there. And that, I think, is an extraordinary experience when that happens.
Yes, it's like a great poem. Evokes what can't be put into words.
Yeah.
In contemporary systems thinking, complexity science, there's some notion that complex systems self-generate, that autopoiesis, they even use that term, autopoiesis. And there's even a thought that life or metabolisms back in the ocean fumaroles, in the deep ocean, the black smokers they call them, where they think proteins and the most primitive organisms first formed. They think they started as metabolisms. This is one thought about it. And they self-metabolized and then continued metabolizing, meaning they continued doing the process of ingesting and turning what they ingested into energy. And so I've heard a complexity scientist say maybe poems are like that. They're sometimes when a poet contacts a poem, they've contacted a little self-generating system, a little auto-poetic system, and they're merely the kind of context in which the poet is the context in which that auto-poetic function can happen, so that we're just a host for something better than us, so to speak, or more than we could ever produce ourselves, to generate itself. I mean, I don't know whether this is. I'm just thinking, like, why am I bringing that in? We were talking about because language as well. Well, in one school of thought, it's this is getting a bit out there maybe, but it's a mimetic, it's memes, in Richard Dawkins's term, these cultural equivalents of genes. Languages are meme systems.
Mhm.
And maybe they get their fulfillment in a poem, that a language finds its own way to its complete fulfillment, doing all it can do. Granted that it has these hosts, these human hosts with all it needs the human hosts, the language system obviously does. And it can harvest all it can get out of a human and the human experience and generate this little marvel that is the best language can be, the ultimate that language can be. But it's kind of sort of
Right.
generating itself.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bit wild, but I don't know. Yeah.
No, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. I think that's quite true. The poet is like a conduit, or like, as you say, a host,
Yeah.
but it's something else that's coming through. And yeah, I love that idea of kind of self-organizing because, of course, I'm sure you know this, when you're feeling, truly inspired, it doesn't feel like you're writing the poem, right? I mean, it feels like it's coming through you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the idea that language is using us to find its highest perfection, maybe that's not the right word, but
Yeah. Yeah.
its most complete expression. Uh,
Yeah.
that's that's great. Oh, I love that. That's wonderful.
Yeah. To sort of fulfill itself,
Yeah, yeah,
to be the most it can be or something.
yeah, yeah.
But I mean, maybe
Um,
okay, this is again getting out there, but maybe that aligns in some way with, the all the almost platitudes people say about, well, human being is the universe being conscious of itself. And
yeah,
so maybe there's something about um our tapping into our consciousness,
yeah.
freed of our ordinary tactical, strategic
Right,
thinking,
right
and
brain,
our
left brain thinking. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Maybe there's something about that as well that is sort of, you know, what I'm really getting out there, but
no, it's good. Yeah,
original nature, original consciousness, original mind wants to, fulfill itself through human awakening or something.
right.
I've heard things like that said in deep
Yeah,
spiritual traditions, but
right.
maybe that's analogous almost to what happens when a poem
Yeah,
comes through. It's there's some kind of fulfillment there
yeah,
that maybe in some ways analogous to the experience of awakening. I mean, in moments of really radical awakening, when we lose our sense of self and we feel, we're just not separate, and I think that's the most awake we can be. Personally, it's the most awake I've ever been is in those moments of real what Zen calls kensho, when we're just the idea of being a separate self has just gone, and they feel like some kind of fulfillment that's
mhm,
more than my own. Those moments that, because there's I don't know whether that strikes a chord with you, John, but the first time I had one, I've written about this when I was
mhm,
19. I've talked about it as well, plenty. But it felt so fulfilling that I knew I could die that night and
mhm.
have been a completely fulfilled life. You
Wow.
know,
Wow.
I don't. So yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah. Again, I'm sorry, I'm taking us in tangents, but the poem somehow being analogous to that, it's something. There's something so fulfilled and fulfilling about a really accomplished poem. I'm not sure I've written one myself, by the way, but when I read them, that this is, wow, how did this get to be so complete?
yeah.
You know,
Like, how is this possible? And
yeah,
in that sense, it's like it's another instance of like the best that humans are capable of. And I think that's really life-giving to be reminded of that because it's easy to forget, because there's so much horror in the world. But these
yes,
moments of beauty, and I think that word's been banished from academia, but I'm glad we can still use it. Um, that's, you know, we want that. We want that.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that love of beauty, love of the beauty of the world is what's gonna help us possibly save it, you know. And I think poetry's purpose in that sense is to is to remind us of our true nature and of the beauty of the world and how we might be in the world in a way that is more humble and appreciative and open and yeah, but yeah, I love everything you said, Henry. I think that's all just absolutely right. I just resonated with all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I'm thinking now because of what you're saying about changing our way of being in the world. That seems so important. And I'm thinking of Seamus Heaney's book, The Redress of Poetry.
Mhm.
It's sort of it's a long time since I read it, but I think it was his lectures that he gave when he was professor of poetry at Oxford. I think that's what that book is, if I remember right. But he's sort of saying, you know, yeah, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, but don't imagine that, you know, a poem will change the world. But on the other hand, poetry offers a redress to what, you know, kind of morally offends us. It's a redress of what's a redress toward what is
Yeah.
awry in the world, you
Right.
know. And I think that's, and I think possibly through that, the change of heart it can inspire in us can actually, I think,
Yeah.
can change the world, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it spreads.
Change of heart, change of consciousness.
Well, true.
Because
Yeah.
if there's not a collective awakening in terms of consciousness, whatever technical fixes we make are not gonna matter really. And yeah, I think that's where poetry can have a huge impact on the level of heart consciousness and opening. Yeah, I love that redress of how did you say it, of the aspects of the world that offend our sensibilities or that trample, you know,
Yeah.
our finer nature. um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
a
Yeah.
restoration of a right relationship to the world, which
Yes.
we've strayed so far from that, from a, you know, kind of kinship relationship with the world that our Stone Age ancestors certainly had.
Yeah.
Um,
And you can still see it in indigenous wisdom today.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, that amazing book, Braiding Sweetgrass, you know, the
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
I've just blanked on her name, but it's what a beautiful evocation of the kind of reciprocity that is endemic to a lot of indigenous thought, and that, you know, rapacious colonialist modern Europeans, or not only, you know, post medieval onwards, really, just didn't have any sense of.
Well, wanted to destroy.
And what, yeah, well, yeah, yeah, absolutely, and had no no corrective to their extractive, exploitative instincts.
Yeah.
You know, it's
And
so
the result of that. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Robin Wall Kimmerer is the
Thank
author
you.
of.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Um,
And I'm reading another book called Hospicing Modernity, which is a really radical
wow,
book.
wow.
But the author, and I can't remember her name, but she talks about how colonialism isn't just something that happened in the past. The coloniality is something that still governs the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about reality, the way we think about our relationships to the earth. Um, and yeah, bringing awareness to that it is, I think, just so crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am, well, I don't want to cast stones, but I tend to think that there's an Abrahamic component here in the Western mind. And that's one of the reasons I call my new book Original Love, as a counter to original sin, you know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
because it seems the original sin of the West has been
Yeah.
those doctrines in the
Yeah.
early books of the Bible, you know,
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Before, I was asking about writing for an audience. And maybe there's a distinction that you've both teased out here, which is it seems the poet doesn't write for an audience, not really, at least you don't. But you presumably publish for one. The instinct to share poetry that you've written presupposes an audience. Maybe it shouldn't, as you pointed out for most poets. Maybe even publishing shouldn't presuppose an audience. But anyway, and that seems like you've begun to explore some of the hopes you have for your poetic expression when it starts to leave your poetry book, your notebook, and goes out there into the world and is read by others. It has an impact, participates somehow.
I know for me, reading poems has changed my life. And I know that's a sort of cliched way to say it, but it's true. And so I have to believe that the potential is there when a book goes out to find its way to that one reader in the junk store or wherever who might, come upon a poem that, lights something up, that creates this sense of aliveness that you were talking about, Henry. And that makes it all worth it. And I think it's true that people are turning to poetry more now than they have perhaps in the more recent past. I mean, somebody said in times of crisis, people turn to poetry. Well, we're in kind of a perpetual crisis now. And so I think people are drawn to poetry in a way that is encouraging. I think people are seeking it out and feeling the importance, the magnitude of poetry in a way that's encouraging.
Yeah. It would be nice to invite you both to read something of your own work.
From No Day, the piece is called Walk the Talk. Sometimes I think human beings are just a way for words to walk around on earth, and words just a way for wind to hear itself think.
Wow. Oh, that's gorgeous. Oh,
Yeah, I'll read this poem, Swifts. Early fall, the light thin and brittle. And if it's true that deprivation is a gift, I accept the gift. I walk down to Wallace Park to watch the swifts that roost every September in the Chapman School's tall brick chimney. The charming swifts with their long forked tails and swept back wings, 10,000 of them swerving and darting in the evening sky, a flowing, expandable spiral of birds, clearing the air of insects and riveting the wandering human mind. Tonight there must be 300 spectators, a whole hillside of us, ordinary people whose wings fell off eons ago, who traded flight for speech and have regretted it ever since. Sodden and earthbound as we are, except for our lifted eyes, our oohs and ahs that show we're still alive when the peregrine falcon dives in and knifes one out of the air, which we boo or cheer, sometimes simultaneously. We love this passion play of form and formlessness, the birds' shifting patterns flung out like a whiplash of water or school of fish above the stationary human school, then drawn tight together, a miracle they don't crash into each other, a miracle of echolocation until you see them as they truly are, a single organism, a body made mostly of air and quick decisions, jagged motions that gradually cohere, a poem, in other words. It takes the flock a full 20 minutes to funnel down into the chimney, and it seems a living smoke pulled back into a still and sleeping fire. So beautiful, I forget for a moment my father's death, or I turned my mind away from it, or no, I open my grief to accommodate this wonder and wonder what he might have thought of it, were we standing here together, the kind of thing we never did and now will never do, except in my imagination, that unchanging inner sky where the swifts take flight whenever I want them to, and my father cannot die.
Beautiful.
yeah.
No, thank you.
That's a really stunning poem. I've read that a couple of times now,
Thank you. Thank
several times actually. Yeah, but fantastic.
you. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, right. It's the, if I was in the room with you, you'd feel my glow and my heart opened by that. Oh,
I can feel it. Yeah, I
oh,
can. Yeah, thank you for that.
oh, I love that. I love that. Oh, it's just spectacular. Yeah.
Um, that means a lot, Henry. Yeah,
Oh my gosh. Oh.
yeah, yeah. But I'd love to hear some of your poems.
Just to let everybody know that it's called Yahrzeit, which is, the 1 year anniversary of a death in the Jewish world. I just want to say it's got the word weir in it. It's a kind of dam that flow where the water can flow over on rivers and often associated with canals and channels and things. So Yahrzeit. The young heron pauses in the middle of the weir to stare at me and waits there so long on its single stilt, one webbed foot held aloft, the other planted in the pour of water, not a feather stirring, just the long neck adjusting for balance like a snake, and the hazel target of its eye locked on mine, that time stands still. The damp day turns bright, the elms sigh in a wind not made of air. The path under my feet softens like skin, and the river presses its cool hands on my ears. What is this pressure holding my head? Why am I remembering all of a sudden that today is the anniversary of your death, and wondering where you've gone 1 year on, or whether you've gone at all? Who is this bird fixing me with its eye? Stately as an Egyptian prince, as if wearing time like a pair of wings, it has only to open to bring back all the years of your life. At last, it lowers its foot and moves on.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah.
beautiful. Just incredible. God, there's so much I want to say. I mean, it feels like it embodies so much of what we've been talking about here. This quality of awakening and luminosity and stopping and connecting. I mean, the fact that this bird is looking, staring into your eyes,
Yeah.
you know, on this momentous
Yeah.
date. And just, I mean, just the writing is just so gorgeous. What was the line about the wings? As if time,
Oh yeah, as if wearing time like a pair of wings. Yeah.
wearing a pair of wings, which is then what's the rest of it?
Oh, as if wearing time like a pair of wings that has only to open to bring back all the years of your life. Actually, by the way, it's about my dad. It was
Yeah,
after my dad's death. Yeah.
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 But that's such an incredible turn in the poem because I mean, that takes us then to the father and the loss and it's beautiful, Henry. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's actually one from the new book, Original Love. So,
Oh, great. Great. Yeah. So that book has prose and poems.
yes, much, much, much more prose.
Okay. But that poem's in it. I'm glad to know that because
Yeah,
I want
yeah,
to read the
yeah.
poem again. So wow. Thank you. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, so Finisterre is both a peninsula in Brittany, northwest France, and a part of Portugal, also in the northwest corner of Portugal. And of course, it means end of the land. There's Land's End in the UK as well, at the end of Cornwall. But all three of them pointing out to the Atlantic Ocean, the great ocean, you know. So this is just a little thing, really. Finisterre. Yes, the land ends here, but every sailor knows this is where the journey begins. The voyage starts here.
Nice. I love it. Oh, I love it. I love short poems. I love the way they just drop us. They just into this huge opening that they've created. It's beautiful. Yeah, this is where the voyage begins.
Well, thank you both. I don't know what to say, really. This exceeded my already rather high expectations, and we've ended in just the most wonderful way. I'm just a mess now after that. That was wonderful. Thank you both. Wow. Bloody hell.